It is Friday, June 23rd. Let's talk PlayStation. Hello everyone, welcome back to another frazzled episode of LTPS, and also happy Final Fantasy XVI, not launch day, because that was yesterday, but, the game's out. I have to wait for my deluxe edition to ship, so there you go, digital owners. You once again have the last laugh with your fancy preload and your whole downloading to the console thing. I will patiently wait for my disc. And having said that, let's start off with what we always do, our PS Plus reminder. So if you haven't just yet, make sure you claim the June PS Plus Essential Games. You still have some time left there. And also the PS Plus Extra and Premium lineup is live on PSN as well, so you can go check those games out. I'm telling you, try Inscription. Now for our first story, let's also talk about more PS Plus stuff, which is a new PlayStation 5 bundle with 2 years of PS Plus Premium. This was spotted by @ZubiTech on Twitter, and this console, from what we see, is located in Germany, so that's where the, I would assume the filings were for this art or listing or whatever the case may be. Essentially, we don't know when it's coming out, the pricing details, if it's going to release somewhere else, but certainly a very interesting PS5 bundle, considering Sony is looking to, I guess, make the service a lot more sticky, bolster their numbers for that upper tier of the service, and depending on the price, not a bad buy at all, because you're essentially locking in 2 years of having access to nearly 1,000 games, right? If you take off all the PS3 streaming, you're still looking at 700 something titles. So not a bad option at all, and again, something where I think Sony is certainly confident in the satisfaction rate for that upper tier of the service, and this would be a great way to again bolster those numbers for how many subscribers are on the service for people just buying PS5s the first time. Now, going back to Final Fantasy XVI, the game is out now, so one thing we can talk about is the review scores, which came out on Wednesday, and so far been received very well. So over on Metacritic, the game is sitting at an 88 across 100 different reviews, and then on OpenCritic, it's sitting at a 90 across 87 different reviews. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have seen, but there is, in fact, a day one patch, which the producer, Naoki Yoshida, did have to apologize for that, considering they were expecting to not have a patch. But it is there for it's fixing a minor issue with progression, some text errors, and a rare bug which could cause the game to close. Allegedly, it does also help performance a bit, but we're already seeing that the game's performance mode doesn't really hit 60 all that well consistently, so it's more of an unlocked mode, like the high 30s to 40s. But it is something where you don't need the day one patch, which is still, I think, largely their goal of shipping a game on disc, that you don't need a patch if you want to just jump in and start playing it right away. And the day one patch is quite small, I believe. But it's great to see the review scores have been, the game has been received well. I think the demo certainly did go a long way on selling people on the experience if they were on the fence. And it really is kind of feels like a turning point for the franchise, right? So it's always been historically this kind of game where you might have expectations of what it is gameplay wise, but you could have always started on any game, because mainline Final Fantasy, it's always new characters, new world, new story, right? So barring the few sequels like 10-2 or the 13 trilogy or the online games, most people know you can start on any game. But now the gameplay expectations are subverted here as well, right? So it's a very different kind of Final Fantasy, but as Square was talking about earlier this week, the Final Fantasy name has always been something where it can be anything, and I think this entry really proves across the board it can be anything, not just expecting something from the gameplay department. And that kind of is exciting, that it could maybe be anything for, say, 17, 18, whatever they want to call these games. They do a lot with the Final Fantasy name, and it pays for them to take risks. Now, one other thing we should mention is a report that came out from the website Twisted Voxel, where they were citing a Reset Era thread, and it wasn't a big one, but just a thread of people playing the Final Fantasy XVI demo and encountering PS5 overheating issues. That and a few other games in there, but again, it wasn't a big thread. So they were citing that, and also a tweet from Susie Hunter, where she mentioned her console also did the self-shutdown notice because it too was getting too hot. And she says she was playing a game that was unreleased. I presume safely that was also Final Fantasy XVI, but the point is, I wouldn't, this isn't one of those things where it's like a big conspiracy or controversy coming up. Oh no, PS5 consoles are overheating, what's the big deal here? It's just, I find it interesting that some might encounter this when there's two things at play here. Number one, the consoles are getting quite old. So, and I say quite old, like, nearly 3 years, right? If you bought a PS5 near launch, around launch, and you haven't done any kind of preventative maintenance, now would be a good reminder to, do that, especially because Sony has made a system that has never been easier to maintain, considering the console covers can easily be taken off. They're meant to be removed by the user, so you can at the very least do that. If you want to go the extra mile, another very non-invasive, easy process is removing the fan assembly. Trust me, it's not complex. You do need a T8 security bit screwdriver, but if you get that, you can get full access to the fan assembly. You can clean it that way, and that would be a great way to maintain and keep your PS5 in good shape. That also depends largely on, where you place the console. Do you have a lot of dust in your home, pet hair, things like that, right? Also the ambient temperature. These things all contribute to your console temperature, and that is a security measure if your console does get too hot and it tries to turn itself off, right? But just consider all those things. But that, alongside how this, for this particular game, we are getting into year 3 of PS5, nearly 3 years, more PS5 exclusives too, and that means we're going to see more games that might be considered worst case scenarios. And what I mean by that is games that really push the hardware to not quite its limits. I don't really know if we're there just yet, but these games are going to be, putting a lot of stress on the system. Well, stress may not be the best word there, but like a worst case scenario game on PS3 would be The Last of Us, God of War 2018 on PS4. Those games, even on fresh thermal paste systems, will still kick in the fan curves on those machines because they push the hardware. We may see those games soon on PS5, and perhaps FF16 is one of those titles. So combine that with maybe a system that has a lot of dust, blocking, impeding on the thermals of your console, you may run into that issue. So just a good reminder that, hey, every year or so, clean your console, and if that does not work, then that's where I would say maybe you've got a bigger problem. Moving on to some new Spider-Man 2 details. Nothing too mind-blowing here, but if you were expecting a demo, then don't, because Insomniac gave a pretty clear-cut answer on Twitter. They just said, no, we don't have any plans. I was not expecting one at all, because Sony is not going to have any problem whatsoever selling millions of copies of this game on day one, so no demo. Or at least not an Insomniac, tailor-made demo. Maybe 6 months later we'll see something on PS Plus Premium where it's the full game, but there's just a software time allotment tied to it. Maybe that, but I don't think so, considering they're, again, going to sell a lot of this game on day one. But that is one thing. We also learned that for the Digital Deluxe Edition with the 10 exclusive suits, there is no way to earn those suits via standard in-game progression. You'll have to buy the Digital Deluxe Edition or pay the difference to upgrade it from a base copy, which you can do. They did this with Miles Morales and also Rift Apart as well, and they even make it pretty easy where there is a, on the main menu of those screens, of those games I should say, you can hit R1 I think it is, and that will take you to the transaction page for those, for the digital deluxe versions of those games, right? Or the Ultimate Edition for Miles Morales, but you get the idea. So you can still buy it with a base copy, even disc, but for the time being, it's very much a little upsell monetization thing. So not much that can really be done. I don't think they're going to reverse that or anything. Maybe further down the line, they'll eventually offer it via an update or in-game, but for now it's very clearly it's tied to the Digital Deluxe Edition. Moving on to our next story, a corporate shakeup is going on at PlayStation's newly formed mobile division, where Nicolas Sebastiani, the former head of Apple Arcade's head of content, who was appointed the head of the new PS Studios mobile division, and that was almost 2 years ago now, but he has already left. So in his place is Chris Davis. He used to work at the big mobile entertainment company Kabam. He had actually already joined PlayStation last year, but he's now the co-head of this initiative alongside Olivier Cotemanche. They two were hired last year. They were the senior director and the head of mobile product at PlayStation Studios before now joining with Chris Davis, but they've had experience at Meta, EA, and Zynga. So seems like we are seeing some growing pains for what is an entirely new arm of the company. That's expected. They are bringing on the right people, but it's something where you can't throw the right people at a problem and hope it works, or rather, not a problem per se, but just trying to get into a sector that you historically have had very little presence in. But it seems like with Nicolas Sebastiani, leaving in less than 2 years, it clearly shows that perhaps his vision, idea, and perhaps the roadmap for where he wanted this thing to go maybe wasn't quite aligning with the higher-ups at Sony. So even though it seems like it was an amicable departure, nothing crazy bad was going on there. But perhaps they're just still trying to figure out where they really want to take this thing. So. Or maybe he was only brought on for the short term just to get the team established, which he did, and then leave. So who knows? It's all speculation. But even though I don't care for mobile games, I certainly want to see how this part of the business plays out for them. Now let's get into our Microsoft ABK news and start with something that we have not touched on just yet, which is the gamers lawsuit. So for those that don't know, there was a lawsuit filed last year by like 9 or 10 sort of on-the-ground consumers, Call of Duty players, and that's why this has been dubbed the gamers lawsuit, where they're more or less trying to prevent the deal, calling it anti-competitive and this and that. So kind of silly, obviously, but something where we can't cover everything, so we've mostly ignored that lawsuit. But recently something interesting came out of that suit. So lawyers representing the group of gamers have brought forth Exhibit K, which is a document sealed by the court, so it is mostly redacted. But the plaintiffs claim it's an internal Microsoft email from the Xbox CFO Tim Stewart saying that their plan is to put PlayStation out of business. Microsoft confirmed in a follow-up statement to Axios that the email in question was sent in 2019, before most of their major deals, and also Microsoft's filed responses that they called it a thought experiment. So they're more or less dismissing the importance of it as evidence. Now, honestly, I don't really think there's much to say on this because, it's redacted. We don't have any context. We don't know how it was said. We do have the timing, which is right in the middle of their acquisition season, more or less. That's after a few studios in 2018, right before the big acquisitions in 2019, right? So that just means that there's certainly conversations and things being set in motion for being motivated to pick up big publishers. And so we all get an idea of the motivation behind the words. But, I mean, big surprise, Sony wants the same thing. I hope people do understand that. For what are a bunch of big mega corporations, I mean, the optics don't look good when they just say it in internal emails and that gets aired out. But they're always, all companies sort of have that motivation behind them, which is they would love to have one market completely cornered, and they're just so far ahead of everything else that, it's very hard for any competitors to really break into the space. So for Microsoft, despite, Phil Spencer's candidness on, live streams and podcasts, even recently with the Kind of Funny thing, saying they lost the most important generation and this and that. Now, he'll always be candid and honest, but the motivation will always be there for the company to, increase their position in this market. So Microsoft, of course, they would love to, do this, even though the optics don't look good. And it is ironic, given that Microsoft has certainly had this sort of happy-go-lucky 2-3 year brand image of we're for the players, we're for all platforms and more gamers and this and that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's harmless, positive messaging, but behind the scenes, we all know that's how these companies operate. And Sony, very much the same. In fact, it seems like they're just more stoic and open about it with, how aggressive they are with their marketing right deals and timed exclusivity and things like that. So nothing is really too surprising here, but I thought that was funny to see come out. Now, getting back to the normal proceedings of the ABK deal, we've got the FTC's preliminary injunction case going on right now, which runs from the 21st, 2nd, 3rd, all the way to, then it goes back to the 27th, 8th, and 9th. So, and I'm actually filming this a bit early because I'm leaving this weekend, so I can't quite cover everything, but so far at least, here are some things that came out. So, courtesy of Stephen Totilo of Axios, he shared a few of the exhibits that Microsoft is planning to use for their defense against the FTC. And a lot of the emails that they're showing off here, or they're going to show off, relate to the business. So there's some crazy interesting topics in here that show discussions between Phil Spencer and Jim Ryan, the commitments they were offering to Sony post-merger, Xbox Game Studio titles on Switch. There's another one for Xbox Game Studio titles for PlayStation and Switch. So these are all emails that Microsoft plans to bring up and use for their defense. Now, something else that came up is a deposition from April where Jim Ryan, who is indeed testifying during this, said that if the deal were to close, Sony would not be able to share details with Activision about their next console. Now, if you remember a while ago, this was something I brought up, which is, there's a conflict of interest when new hardware does come around, and then you have to start shipping dev kits. But obviously things are swinging both ways now, with Sony developing MLB on Xbox, Bungie being owned by Sony, then there's Minecraft and the live service titles Microsoft still supports. So the deposition doesn't cover this. They do mention Minecraft, but Jim Ryan's answers are redacted. Anyway, a big part of the FTC's arguments is that, they're looking at what Microsoft did with these ZeniMax Media games, and we already discussed a lot of that at the time when those arguments initially came up, so I imagine a lot of those arguments are going to be repeated here, and therefore we don't have to talk about them. But that's what we have so far. So again, I'm filming this a bit early. We can't cover everything. I'm sure there's something here I'm going to miss, but there's a lot that's going to come out of these proceedings. So let me stop myself right there because, like I said, I had to film that a bit early, so I was basically missing most of the proceedings on Thursday, which would have been when I normally record LTPS. But we're squeezing in this clip at the last minute because one crazy thing that came out, and there's actually a ton in there, a lot of it mostly relating to the Xbox business, but this is one exhibit that Microsoft brought up for their defense, which is an email from the SI president and CEO Jim Ryan. He apparently sent this email to a former Sony CEO. We don't know who that is right now, although there's only a few names we can really cycle through, but the point is this email shows what it appears to be his sort of gut reaction and feelings on the announcement of Microsoft acquiring Activision Blizzard. So this would have been around the time that they made the initial announcement. And so Jim Ryan says in this email, and I quote here, "It is not an exclusivity play at all. They're thinking bigger than that, and they have the cash to make moves like this. I've spent a fair amount of time with Phil and Bobby, and I'm pretty sure we will continue to see Call of Duty on PlayStation for years to come." He then goes on to say that we have some good stuff cooking. I'm not complacent. I'd rather this didn't happen, but we'll be okay. We'll be more than okay. So this is definitely pretty nutty, and it kind of goes into our last story, right, where you've got a Microsoft internal email and they're saying something that may not be all that shocking, but the optics don't look good when you compare them to what they say publicly. Here, it's kind of the same thing. Now, I would I would argue that this is a bit more surprising that, the sort of gut reaction to the initial announcement is that very much, hey, we understand that they're probably not going to make Call of Duty exclusive, so perhaps they weren't nearly as, afraid in that moment, although Jim obviously saying that, hey, I would rather this did not happen. But I guess it is important to also, understand the moments preceding it and, well, in this case, what happened afterwards, because if that is what he initially thought right then and there, we saw where the aggression initially kicked in of conversations happening and Microsoft offering 3 years. Maybe Jim did not like those terms. And the thing is, we don't have those terms, but perhaps it was not nearly as good as, say, once Microsoft finally got up to 10 years and, piling on more additional things like we'll do streaming, we'll do PS Plus, here's, more things as they saw more and more heat from regulatory bodies. But when we compare what Jim's saying, in this email, which, at this point was a year ago, but compare that to what he was then preaching to regulatory bodies, optics. It's funny how these things work out, but it really does go back to that last story. So both these companies, they're not your friend, and in the case of Sony, we can see that, either they again, the aggression really kicked in, the more this process went on, and they thought, well, maybe we have a fighting shot at maybe stopping this, because there's still no ideal scenario where they want Activision to be owned by a competitor, even if they do believe that Microsoft will keep Call of Duty on there for the, let's say, short to mid-term, right? So even after 10-something years, who knows what that's going to look like when your competitor does have so much leverage on a very popular IP in all those studios. But that one email, crazy stuff for sure. So that's why it's worth watching and paying attention to these proceedings. I guess the other noteworthy item in here is that the Indiana Jones game that was announced right before the acquisition of ZeniMax Media, the correspondence with Disney shows that game was planned on being on multiple platforms. Then the deal was amended after the acquisition, which we now have confirmation it will be an Xbox and PC exclusive. I don't think that's really all that surprising, but that might be a little thorn in Microsoft's defense. But this is something where they still are going to be in a pretty strong position given everything thus far. Now, the one thing I definitely cannot cover are the proceedings happening today, so there's going to be more hot stuff coming out, which we will talk about next week on LTPS. So for now, let's move on to the next news story. Moving on to a minor update for the Ghost of Tsushima movie by the director Chad Stahelski, where he was recently speaking with comicbookmovie.com, and he more or less talked about how he loves the storyline, the thematics, and how it's such an anti-samurai game, and it's great source material. That's not the problem, but the problem is translating it into something palpable, a 2.5-hour experience, something for movies, possibly expanding further on to TV and maybe doing TV shows, a sequel, something like that, but essentially trying to figure out the best way to convert it properly, which makes sense. And he does also confirm they're heavy in development, so they're pretty much in the midst of getting this thing together. And it kind of reminded me of, I guess, the existence of this project, right? I mean, it's actually kind of interesting that we've got so many PS Productions projects going on. But yeah, I mean, Tsushima does have such an incredible story, so that is something where out of the few properties where I'm like, that seems a bit strange, Twisted Metal, or I'm a little bit nervous, God of War, Horizon. This, I'm like, this could be so perfect. So I've got really high hopes that this turns out okay. Now, in a somewhat related story, and I say somewhat because I completely forgot about this as well, but it's not a PS Productions adaptation, but the Death Stranding movie. So Kojima recently put this out on Twitter. He says, quote, "Just to be clear, I am deeply involved in producing, supervising, plotting, look, design, and content of the film adaptation of Death Stranding, just not in charge of directing." Well, just to be clear, I don't think there's any situation where he would not be doing all of those things. I cannot picture any circumstance where Kojima is not doing just that, being deeply involved in the project, because that's kind of what he also wants to do, not just games. He has always wanted to do things like music and TV, film, so yeah, that much was obvious. But yeah, there's that movie coming out too, which I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, Death Stranding is getting an adaptation too, which I think could also work quite well. I get it, not the kind of game for everybody, but if you were into it, then I would hope one would agree that a film adaptation could work. But yeah, we have that. And then also, just as a FYI, there's a new documentary coming out called Hideo Kojima Connecting Worlds, which follows the development of Death Stranding. So there was recent screenings, and I guess they were kind of okay, something where they maybe didn't focus too much on Kojima himself, where it's about his early childhood and his process. There's not much of that, and more of just, celebrities sharing anecdotes about him. So I guess that's the general consensus on that or something. I don't know. It sounds a little weird, but that was screened, so it should be coming out fairly soon, and that is something where PlayStation was involved, but it's not PS Productions still technically, but just as a little PSA, that is also coming out, I think, soon. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk, plus the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you would like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very easy. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. those are some of the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And our Tuesday video was another collection update finally. So I know it's been a long time since we last did one. Just been slow on the game buying, so you can check out my recent pickups from the last year and a half. We'll keep doing those as long as you enjoy watching them, but that's what happened with that. And then, as always, another upload on Tuesday. But until then, that is it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.